It was a summer between my 7th and 8th grade years. I was at youth camp. It was 3D camp, Camp Zephyr, which is somewhere near Corpus Christi, Texas, and it was hot. It was so hot. And every morning I would get up and go out to a picnic table out on the campground with my Bible and a country time lemonade and have my morning devotions. Now you might think, man, you sound like a really spiritual kid. You sound like you're really spiritually mature for your age. But the reality was I was trying to impress a girl. I was trying to impress the pastor's daughter, in fact. And I thought, what better way to impress her than to be seen out having my morning devotion? So, I wasn't, my motives weren't entirely pure. I actually wasn't driven by knowledge of the word and a desire to spend time with God. I was trying to be impressive. But one morning, as I was going through my morning devotions there at that picnic table, drinking my country time, looking at my Bible, I found myself in a passage in Exodus where God calls Moses into ministry. And I found it really peculiar. It began to stand out to me in ways that it never had before. I was somewhat familiar with the story. It's the story of the burning bush and the call upon Moses to go demand the freedom of the Israelites from Pharaoh. So it was a story I'd heard since, Sunday school. But there was something about it this morning that began to do an extraordinary work in my heart. The exchange between Moses and God was very pronounced for me. Even things like Moses saying, I'm slow of speech. Now, we don't know exactly what he was referring to there. It could be a speech impediment. It could have just meant that he wasn't eloquent or he didn't feel eloquent or equipped to speak publicly, that sort of thing. But a lot of us think maybe it was a speech impediment of some kind. I was a stutterer from kindergarten. In fact, I struggled with stuttering all the way into college. But that just sort of resonated with me in that moment. Here's God calling this stutterer into ministry. But there were other aspects of it as well. Moses saying things like, who am I? There were issues of identity and validation, things that kind of laid uncovered in my own heart. This text began to kind of peel back these long dormant insecurities and timidities in my own life. And in one moment, I had no clue whatsoever about pursuing any kind of ministry, especially at that age. And in the next, I believed that God was saying, you, Jared, I'm calling you into church ministry. It was an alien idea. I didn't grow up in a ministry family. I grew up, going to church. I grew up with a Christian family, but my dad wasn't a pastor. My grandpa wasn't a pastor. There was no pressure on me to, be in vocational ministry. At that age, my highest aspiration probably was to write, for Batman comics. That would have been, if someone said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I wanted to write comic books. That's what I wanted to do. But there was this alien thought that just entered my intellectual atmosphere, into my spiritual orbit. You're going to be in ministry. Now, I didn't know exactly what that meant then, but I somewhat understood that it was a calling not just to pursue ministry, but to understand it, to begin to see what does it mean actually to be a pastor. The concept of the pastor is phrased predominantly in the New Testament as an elder or an overseer. Those are the synonyms for the word pastor. And it is an elder, an overseer, a pastor, is someone who is tasked with the spiritual leadership and care of a local congregation. The word pastor, in fact, comes from the word for shepherd, from the pasture work, so to speak. It's one who tends the flock. But who should be a pastor? Men who are qualified, called, and commissioned. We'll take each little piece one by one. What does it mean to be qualified? A pastor needs to be a qualified man. Well, there's 3 primary passages we look to in Scripture to give us the qualifications for the pastorate. We find them in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, and 1 Peter chapter 5. And we find something really interesting in those passages. And you take them as kind of a composite portrait of what ministry ought to look like, what a minister ought to look like, in fact. We notice something really interesting. There are very few, in fact, maybe only one qualification in those lists, in all 3 chapters, that would be characterized as a skill set. Only one would be considered a kind of skill set. which is able to teach. Pastors ought to be able to teach. All of the other qualities are dispositions. They're characteristics. They're sort of aspects of not just personality, but of spiritual maturity. It's things like gentleness and self-control. It's things like being hospitable. You don't see anything in the passages about being a visionary leader or a catalytic kind of leader. You don't see anything really even about being an intellectual type. You don't see anything about being a dynamic speaker or being overly eloquent. What we see is really that those who are qualified for pastoral ministry are those who exude the characteristics that would help them or make them look more like Jesus. Now, that one skill set that's listed, able to teach, that's a really important qualification, and it actually distinguishes, it's one of the major distinctions between the office of elder and the office of the deacon. Pastors are to be able to teach, and it's also important because what the pastor does is to be characterized as ministry of the word. In fact, when the diaconate, when the first deacons are sort of commissioned in the book of Acts, we see that those who are reserving their ministry for what we might call eldership, the apostolic ministry that becomes eldership ministry, they say, we will devote ourselves to prayer and ministry of the word. Prayer and ministry of the word become then the major categorical description of what it means to be a pastor. The shepherd of a local congregation, his primary role, his primary task is to pray and help people understand the scriptures, apply the scriptures to their life. So a pastor must be qualified. But secondly, a pastor is someone who is called. He's experienced a call of God upon his life to pursue ministry. Now, there's two kinds of calling, however. There's an internal call and there's an external call. The internal call is exactly what it sounds like. It comes from the inside, so to speak. There's an inclination that is coming personally from within to ministry. Someone has the notion, the idea, or the drive. The scriptures say the person who aspires to ministry desires a noble task. So there's an internal aspiration that takes place. Now, you could say it comes from God, of course, so in a way it's coming from outside, but it is something that is experienced personally and felt personally. That's the internal call. But the internal call has to coincide with, or at least be followed by, an external call, which usually comes from a local congregation or from the leadership of a local congregation. The external call is basically an affirmation of one's suitability, to one's suitedness, or an invitation to pursue that sort of ministry. When I was called into ministry back in that youth camp in junior high school, as soon as I got home, I kind of kept it to myself. I had this sense of internal calling that I didn't know what to do with. And then what happened was I got in my mailbox a letter from the youth pastor of my church, and he was putting together what he called a ministry team. Now, he didn't know anything about my experience at camp. He didn't know that I, quote unquote, felt called to ministry. He probably would have laughed if I had said such a thing, as an eighth grader. But I got this letter in the mailbox, and it basically said, we're putting together this ministry team to serve your fellow students and want you to apply for this ministry. And I took that as a kind of external affirmation. Well, here's a leader who thinks maybe I have the potential to be in ministry. And that was a kind of confirmation for me. So as I began to pursue that, now I'm looking for more affirmation and confirmation in the different churches that I served in. I essentially identify myself as someone who's perhaps not yet qualified for ministry, but wants to be. And so I want to be trained. I want to be invested in. I want someone to mentor me and to disciple me. And so I had leaders who took that seriously, began to affirm my gifts, and to disciple me and train me for this work. That's a kind of external call. It's when someone says, we would say, yes, you do have the potential, you do have the gifts, we do believe that the Lord has put this calling upon your life. You need the internal call and the external call. These are both important aspects of a call to ministry, because if one has an external call without an internal call, They might bristle against the difficulties or the rigors of ministry, or just always find it doesn't quite suit them. I had a fellow in one of my churches that I really wanted to be an elder, and he didn't particularly feel called to be an elder, but I was looking at him and I said, you know what? You are qualified, you're spiritually mature, you would be a huge asset to the elder board. I really think you ought to be a part of this. And, he wanted to, in a way, please, the pastor. He loved the church and wanted to serve the church. And if the pastor was saying, despite his own inclination, that he should be an elder, he decided he was going to submit to that process. Well, the end result was he always felt like a fish out of water. He never quite felt at home on that elder team, and he always felt like he was just kind of there in a way under a kind of duress. So there was an external call for him, but there wasn't an internal call. You really need both of those to understand the fullness of what it means to be called to ministry. Now, if one has an internal call without an external call, they may continue in the aspiration of ministry, but not be suited for it, not be trained for it. They may have a sense of kind of the solo, independent kind of mentality, which is antithetical to the life of church and church ministry entirely. Remember that calling isn't the ultimate decider of ministry qualification. You have to have the external call affirming the internal call. You have to have a local church that says, yes, we confirm that you have these gifts. In a lot of traditions, this is called ordination. I'm calling it commissioned. A pastor is to be qualified, called, and commissioned. What does it mean to be commissioned? Essentially, it means to be recognized by a church. There is a consistent pattern in the New Testament where those who are being brought into ministry are actually being brought in by others. They're not just sort of identifying themselves as one who is called or one who is gifted and pursuing this sort of independent track of ministry. That's really kind of a modern invention. What we have are church leaders and congregations laying hands on potential elders or establishing elders for different church plants. The church is confirming, they are commissioning their own pastors. In the modern church, we have sometimes what's called a licensing for ministry or ordination for ministry, and different denominations, different traditions have different processes by which they may license someone or ordain someone. But really what that is a reflection of the New Testament pattern of a local church being the one to affirm an external call, of a commissioning of the pastor. That has to come from a church itself. It is churches that make pastors. It's not seminaries that make pastors. It's not independent study that makes a pastor. It's not a public ministry of some kind, starting an organization. It's not building a platform. It is a church that makes a pastor. So this is really a call for no Lone Ranger Christians. This is a call to submit to the very people that you mean to serve, that you would be qualified, called, and commissioned by a church. And the very idea, the very power that forms that church is the idea and power that ought to drive the pastor himself. The good news of Jesus, which creates the church, births the church, is also the very power, the very center, the centrality of what it means to be a pastor. Your ministry is to be built around, oriented around the finished work of Jesus.